recruiters and talent acquisition leaders, we have a discussion for you. We're talking about the hiring process and what technology tools are out there to make things more efficient, get better outcomes. We just finished up a conversation around tools, tracking metrics, and speeding up the process. And now we're going to shift to talk more about diversity and global recruitment. So I am joined by Janine Truitt, who is a Chief Innovations Officer at Talent Think Innovations. Thank you for being with us, Janine.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm also joined by Bruce Soltys, who is, I have to get your new title right, the Head of Talent Acquisition Sourcing Strategies at Travelers. Thank you for joining us, Bruce.
Not a problem, thanks.
All right, so for large global employers who have to do a lot of interviewing overseas, what are some tools that you know of that make that a better candidate and a better recruiter experience and get better outcomes? International candidates.
I think quite a few of the ATS systems that are out there have the ability to translate resumes or translate websites such that when it's seen from different countries, it comes in that language. I would think that if you're looking at a global workforce where you're recruiting globally, that would be a good thing, so that it's in their language, but it's your words and it's what you want to come across. So from a candidate experience standpoint, I think that's a neat innovation. I think overall, outside of technology, it requires a lot of flexibility on your part. I think sometimes we have the general consensus that because we do certain things a certain way here in the US, that translates well across the globe. In some ways, yes, you have countries that are, global in a sense, but very much Americanized. But you have many more that just have their own way in which they do things, acquire talent. And so, you have to kind of just be flexible. I know for me, when I've had to recruit globally, I've had to adjust my hours. So it's not going to be a 9-to-5 thing. It is going to be perhaps you speaking to somebody at 11 p.m. at night or 9 p.m. to match their time difference. It may require several conversations, particularly if there's a language barrier and English isn't their first language. That may be something you have to explore. I will say that one of the best things that has happened so far is having video and not having the expenditure of having to fly people back and forth for interviews. So, there's a lot of innovation in that way, but those are just some things that come to the top of my mind.
I think it's an important caveat to now. I think some may hear the question and say, well, we don't hire internationally or we don't sponsor international candidates, but we've seen more, especially in the collegiate ranks, the study abroad aspect, right? So we have US-based students that are studying globally during the semester when interviews are happening. So, really paying attention to the platforms and tools that are, in this space is really important, because even if your company doesn't fall into a category of hiring in global locations and strictly being US-based or not sponsoring candidates, you may very well find yourself in some of the situations that Janine had just mentioned in terms of time zone, technology availability, bandwidth, familiarity with those tools from a college student perspective, right? That this is something we're seeing colleges really start to educate their students on how to use video, whether it's live or pre-recorded, being cognizant of your surroundings, what's in the background, and all things like that I think we sort of take for granted, but applies to a lot more companies than we think because of some of the aspects that I just mentioned, even if you're not, an international player in a sense.
Interesting. Good point. What are some tools, technology that will help recruiters and talent acquisition leaders recruit more diversity?
You go ahead, Bruce.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think diversity is a really broad topic.
I know, I left it wide open.
Yeah, wide open. Takes on many forms, right? And I think that the categories that fall under diversity portfolios, have grown over the years, which I think is a great thing, just in creating more inclusive environments, in our workplaces. That being said, I think that, approaching it from a diversity in a box solution, or here's the checklist of what you have to do to increase your diversity hiring, I think it's a bit of a slippery slope. Certainly starting at a high level is great, but really matriculating down to the local level. I'm a big proponent of diversity happens locally. It doesn't happen just in time. In part one, Janine talked about recruiting being seen by a lot of folks still as just in time. I think, the ability to impact your diversity and inclusion efforts is a continuous effort. When recs are open, when recs are not open, it's just, you should always be out there sourcing, meeting, engaging folks, because, when opportunities come up, you want to have a readily available pool of candidates and so forth. So I would drive folks there. There are certainly tools and so forth, but how do those tools fit into your local efforts? How do they, looking at the local demographics from an availability perspective, are going to vary from region to region. The diversity needles that you may be looking to move and the goals may accomplish given the function that you're recruiting for. And so forth. So really trying to think locally and at that functional and geographic level when you try to understand how can we embark on this diversity solve.
I agree 150%. I mean, I think, especially for me, having worked for federal contractors, diversity and inclusion almost always gets a bad rap in terms of it just becoming an extra compliance item.
Compliance, yeah.
And so people tend to treat it that way, and they think, well, we have this affirmative action plan and we have these availability numbers and we have these deficits in these particular groups. Well, if I just hire a few people in each of those groups, then we're good. And then I can go back to doing what I did before, right? And so to Bruce's point, that's not a strategy. And I think in terms of technology, I think a lot of people in the technology game kind of got wind of what was happening with OFCCP and EEO stuff in the past few years. And so they jumped on the opportunity to pander to employers by saying, by you posting on our sites, we can get you more diverse slates of people. Now, whether or not that's true for some of those sites, I would say some yes and some not so much. But I'm more traditional in the sense of what Bruce was talking about, that I always believe everything in recruitment and talent acquisition is about relationships. And so I don't believe that there's a technology necessarily out there that will solve that problem. You really have to get out of there, get from behind your computer and meet people and meet them where they are and understand what their plight is, what the barriers are against them being employed. And you've got to start to kind of chip away at those barriers as the employer, as the face of the employer. That's what talent acquisition is. So I would encourage anybody that is thinking like there's a set it and done kind of thing to get away from that and really go back to the table with their partners and think about creative ways that they can be engaging the different groups that they want to.
And I'm glad you brought up that point about barriers to entry, because sourcing is just the beginning, and there are tools to target certain demographics. I mean, we all leave a trail on the internet, and we all can be tracked, and we all can be targeted. So you can certainly source the candidates using those technology tools, but that's just door number one, right? So once you get those people in your ATS, then what do you do? Then the relationships start to begin.
Right.
Similarly, and I think your answers will be a little bit different for this question, because once somebody does walk through the door or they apply for your system, how do you, in terms of technology, are there tools that can help recruiters reduce bias?
I think we've seen not just tools once they're in the ATS, but I think really from a tool set standpoint, it starts even before someone owns a requisition. I think a lot of companies have subscribed and implemented to unconscious bias training. I think that's really the first step for a lot of organizations is to implement that into their diversity and inclusion training offerings and portfolios. I think it's become more and more prevalent, throughout. So I think just awareness of it as a topic is a great first step. And then from a tool set perspective, talking with a lot of other organizations and benchmarking, hearing about the latest trends. Some organizations take it as far as removing names from resumes. At the collegiate level, we often think of bias as, being gender or race or ethnicity based. At the college level, there's a lot of bias about certain schools. Oh, you've gone to this university, so it must mean you're a better student than the individual that went to this university. So the items that fall into the bias, category are certainly widening as well. I've heard of instances where companies will do, blind resumes where it takes off school, right? It takes off, a major, and you really focus on the experience that person brings to the table. That may be a pretty far swing of the pendulum for some folks, but it is conversations that are happening, and I think we're seeing companies, pilot that or at least discuss it when we talk with other individuals across different organizations and industries.
I think for me, the training is almost too late for the issue at hand. So I'm very fond of organizations that are taking a stronger look at who they put in the recruitment department in the first place, and perhaps having those discussions, those really difficult discussions with them in the interview process about what biases they may hold or not, because ultimately that's what's going to play out in your recruitment pool. And I've just seen where the wrong people have been on talent acquisition teams, and I've seen how that adversely impacts certain groups based on what their biases are. So, we're aware, I think, as an industry, or there's certainly a growing awareness around unconscious bias and what that is. And I mean, I've seen it down to people saying, hey, leave off your zip code, just because if you're in a certain state and it's populated by a certain group of people, that may be unfavorable. So there's so many different layers that at some point, if we start really doing that, we will have no resume left.
So you're left with 5 words on the resume, right?
Literally. So, what do you do? That's not going to work. We can't do our job. But I think what we can do is start to have some really difficult conversations, I think, across the HR spectrum about what this thing D&I is and what bias is and what does this look like for the organization, and be driving those conversations to reach a resolution where that doesn't become so much of an issue. I think it really all starts with conversations. And honestly, although we've been somewhat of a driver of having those conversations, I don't know that we've been doing it enough until maybe just about now, due to what's going on in the world. So, I think that's where we're at with it.
And I bring up the training aspect too. You mentioned, obviously from a recruiting standpoint, the recruiters, depending upon the organization, essentially serve as, the gatekeeper or screener on the rec. Mm-hmm. Then it comes down to, train for those managers as well, those decision makers on the recs.
Absolutely.
Right? You talk about that, and that's certainly, probably a broader and longer conversation, but, those involved outside the confines of a talent acquisition organization certainly, could bring that to the table, and then affects ultimately the hiring decision.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just a quick thought on that. There's a lot of instances in which talent acquisition, with their best of intentions, cannot make a good decision because of what Bruce just spoke about. And I think that's something that doesn't get a lot of attention. A lot of times we are the bunch that gets beat up on. And it's almost frustrating because even with our best of intentions, we're not self-governed. And so what he just said is so important, and probably, needs a broader conversation at some time.
Well, I'm glad for the where you took the conversation, even though I tried to trap you into a conversation around technology. Appropriately, the conversation around diversity and bias is really, ultimately, overall, it's not about a technology silver bullet. It's about being aware of who you accept, who you don't accept. One final point I would make is when it comes to metrics and tracking, one thing that recruiters should be doing is taking a hard look at who doesn't make it, right? So at which each point in the funnel, who's dropping off.
Where are they dropping off?
Remember that was part one and part two of that conversation.
Absolutely.
And diverse slates, think that there's a host of other aspects and metrics that you can really look at in terms of that. But yeah, great point. I think at the end of the day, right, technology is a complementer to the recruiting process, right? It doesn't necessarily replace or quick solve, some of the issues that we've been talking about for a while. But how do we best, use technology to complement towards the solutions and may not always be the exact solution.
Just a quick thing, Anna, because I wanted to piggyback off of something Bruce said. So technology is a facilitator, and I think to bring it full to the technology piece, one of the ways that companies can kind of, mitigate for some of the things that can go awry due to bias is really being careful in how you configure it for the people that are going to use it. So making sure that you're very careful in the permissions you give to your recruiters, the permissions that you give to super users, the permissions you give to hiring managers. That's a very basic way of kind of solving for the things that people might do to go above and beyond and root out somebody. You can kind of stop them dead in their tracks at a certain point and say, okay, that's as much as you can do in the system with regard to this applicant. Now it gets passed on to another level. And so, it's the checks and balances that really become important in this way.
That's a good tip. Good tip. I think we should end on that note. Thank you so much to the two of you for being with us today and joining College Recruiter. And I'm sure we will be in touch soon and talk about another talent acquisition topic. So thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone.